Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Jason Oliver Chang. I'm Associate Professor of History in Asian and Asian American Studies at the University of Connecticut, where I'm also Department Head for Social and Critical Inquiry. This is our annual webinar in Asian American Studies called How to Teach, and we focused on various conflicts in Asia as a part of U.S. imperialism as one of the most important elements to broadening and deepening a Asian American Pacific Islander curriculum for public schools in Connecticut. We are celebrating the implementation of two new statutes in Connecticut. One that makes Asian American and Pacific Islander studies mandatory in Connecticut's public schools. So this webinar series, as a part of the Asian and Asian American Studies program's curriculum lab, is a key piece to helping to build out new professional learning, to create, to help teachers adopt new lesson plans, and to broaden the scope of how we teach Asian American studies. And in order to do that, we've invited some amazing scholars to help us, to dig into how to teach the Philippine American War. And in addition to that, we want to build a conversation that's student-centered, that's teacher-centered, right? That really helps to bring context and classroom experience into the conversation. And so we have a really amazing conversation set up for us today, and I want to jump right into it. So first of all, I want to thank my team in the curriculum lab, Jenny Hakila Diaz, Elizabeth George, Matt Hay, who's joining us, and other students and faculty from UConn who have really helped to make this such an important space for creating new curriculum, for conducting professional learning for Connecticut's public school teachers, and really pushing the frontier forward in terms of how, what does a K-12 API curriculum in Connecticut look like? So let me begin by introducing our esteemed guests and scholars. I'll introduce them in the order that they'll be presenting. So first we have Dr. Josephine F. Ong, who is the Guarini Dean's Asian American Studies Dissertation Postdoctoral Fellow at Dartmouth in the Department of Asian Societies, Cultures, and Languages. Going next will be Dr. Daniela Pila, who is Assistant Professor of Critical Race Studies and Sociology at Southern Connecticut State University. Welcome, Danielle. And also a visiting assistant professor of Asian American Studies at the University of Connecticut. So she wears many hats. Grateful to have you with us. And last but not least, Professor Kim A. Wagner, who is Professor of Global and Imperial History at Queen Mary University of London in the School of History. Kim, Josephine, Daniela, welcome. I'm so excited to have you guys here. We're joined by Linda Chen, who is a high school student here in Connecticut, as well as Matt Hay, who is a former high school teacher and now education consultant and really, someone who I've learned so much from, and really pleased to have you with us, Matt. Thanks for making the time to be in the conversation. So to get us started, I would like to invite Josephine to go first. I have some slides that you shared, and so you direct me how you'd like for me to share them. You just tell me when.
Oh, yeah, sure. If you could share them now, Jason, that would be great. In the meantime, I'll do my introduction into my work. So hi, everybody. My name is Josephine Ong. I am a postdoctoral fellow at Dartmouth College. I got my PhD in gender studies at UCLA and my master's in Asian American studies, also from UCLA. I do research on Chamorro-Filipino historical relations and those that are indigenous peoples of Guahan or Guam. I grew up in both Manila and Guam, mainly Guam. So my research is about contextualizing the historical relations between two communities that I grew up with, but also who have experienced multiple histories of Spanish, US, and Japanese colonial violence. And so, for the purposes of today, what I want to talk about is actually based on some of my dissertation work, but mainly my master's thesis on the disabled Filipino revolutionary leader Apolinario Mabini and his writings. The title of my part of the lesson plan is called How to Teach the Philippine American War, Filipino Revolutionary Thought, and the Writings of Apolinario Mabini. Okay, Jason, if you could go to the next slide. Okay, so why Filipino revolutionary thought in a curriculum about the Philippine American War, and why specifically Apolinario Mabini? So the reason why I wanted to discuss Filipino revolutionary thought was to focus on the importance of analyzing Filipinos' own historical and political context. I think most Americans are unaware of what the colonial situation during the Spanish and the U.S. colonial period was for the 1890s, and the Philippine American War was like 1898 to 1902, and the end of it is like disputed. And I think Kim, if I'm not mistaken, will be discussing a little bit about that. But yeah, I think um, to the main topic, I think it's important to think about the different perspectives of Filipinos and to contextualize their own thinking for students to fully understand the Filipinos' reasons for fighting against U.S. colonization. And for that reason, I've decided to dedicate my lesson to the writings of one of the main Filipino revolutionary leaders whose political philosophies motivated a lot of the Philippine Revolution, the Philippine Revolutionary Government, which was formed around uh, after the US invaded the Philippines. And so Mabini's writings are well documented. He had a diary and he published multiple articles under the pseudonym The Sublime Paralytic. And he also corresponded with the Anti-Imperialist League, which was based in Boston, and whose famous one of their famous leaders was Mark Twain. And so I wanted to utilize his writings to also connect students to the Northeast and the role that anti-imperialists, as complicated as they could be, played for Filipino revolutionary leaders and their correspondences with each other. And I also wanted to highlight the role that the Philippine American War and Mabini played in writing as a form of resistance. So multiple forms of resistance that Filipinos were using against US colonization. Okay, take the next slide, please. Oh, and if someone could also give me time reminders, that would be really helpful because I have a lot of context here that I'm just going to briefly go over. So
Sure.
I've included in my lesson plan a long description of the Philippine colonial context during the Spanish colonial period. My research currently discusses both Spanish and US colonization of Guam. And so I wanted to actually contextualize a bit about the role of the friary and the Spanish colonial system, which is a little bit different from the US, so that students and mainly actually instructors, I think like you don't have to teach this whole context to students, but I think for the purposes of like the AP US history exam, for example, what's important to know here, Jason, if you could click once, is like the role that comparisons between US colonial governments and Spanish colonial governments played in supporting and rationalizing US colonization, beginning with the Philippine American War and really, I think, heightening like a lot of the stuff would be 1898 to 1902, and like the Anti-Imperialist League stuff will like appear around that time as well. And so I wanted to include this long description, but it's not necessary to teach this. This is just background information because I think it's important to contextualize how the Philippine American War, the Philippine Revolution, was actually happening in between the Spanish American War and the Philippine, and so the Filipinos are basically caught a bit off guard, and it's important to establish that historical context. Next slide, please, which I've also discussed here in the specific section. So here I've written that the Philippines was invaded August 13, 1898. Months later, we had the Treaty of Paris signed, and so the Filipinos actually had to decide whether or not to actually declare war against the U.S. at this time. And Apolinario Mabini was one of the revolutionary leaders who made that decision and was one of the cabinet leaders of President Emilio Aguinaldo, who decided to declare war against the U.S. and was part of a dictatorial words today. And basically, I think another thing I wanted to highlight here, Jason, if you could press, if you could click, I think, is the role that U.S. colonial ambitions played in invalidating Filipinos' continued resistance. So this is, I think, like a different form of interwar period for Filipinos, and the way that this history is taught for in the Philippines is quite different than it is in the U.S. So I think it's important to underscore here that as these imperial empires, the Spanish and U.S. colonial empires, were negotiating with one another, Filipinos were having to decide whether or not they were continuing to resist against the Spanish. The U.S. were initially allies, but suddenly they had to now go against the U.S. And so this kind of political turmoil within the Philippine Revolution is really important to note. And also, I think it's quite important to trace it through Apolinario Mabini's writings. But for the purposes of this lesson, I wanted to focus on for what reasons were Filipinos deciding to continue the revolutionary fight and to fight against now U.S. colonization. Okay, if you could click next slide, Jason. So the first primary source I have is a letter that Mabini wrote to Miss Blanchard, whose first name was not mentioned in this primary source, as often done at the time for women. But basically, this is a letter that he wrote November 1900, at the time where the Anti-Imperialist League was actually corresponding with Mabini and other Filipino revolutionaries. And here he discusses his own humble background. So unlike other Filipino revolutionaries who came from the educated elite, and were usually mixed race Spanish descended revolutionaries, Mabini was actually, as to put it simply, a scholarship student who was funded by the church and whose parents were originally poor. So he has a different background than most Filipino revolutionaries. And so, Jason, if you could click to the next slide. The reason why I wanted to include this source was for students to analyze the different tone of this letter, the different perspective and background of Mabini, and to also think about the role that correspondence and not just like an armed form of resistance or the war battles that we talk about in the Philippine American War, but that the Philippine American War and Filipino resistance can take multiple forms. Jason, if you could click the next bullet point, I think there's one more there. So in this primary source, I also want to note, to underscore the importance of disability and to have students think about the role that Mabini's disability, because he became disabled actually around the time of the Philippine Revolution and could not use his legs. So how did that influence his role in written advocacy? Next slide, please. And next, I kind of cheated and put two primary sources in one, but they were short. And these are selections from two of Mabini's 1899 letters. One is called, actually, this is one of his publications, Intransigence, and the second one is called America in the Philippines. And what's important to underscore in these two main points is his rationale for using armed resistance and why independence was important for Filipinos to fight for. Next slide, please. I know it's quick, but we'll be, I think, if I'm not mistaken, we'll be releasing the lesson plan also, where you'll get more an in-text detail, but for the interest of time and covering the whole lesson plan, I'm just summarizing here. But I think for this one I have three questions. The first question here is, according to these two articles, why did Mabini think that Filipinos need to fight for independence from the United States? What reason does he provide for Filipinos' use of armed resistance? So one of the main points I want instructors to underscore here is independence as a form of true liberation, and how does Mabini make these arguments, and for what reason does he make these arguments? And I think this is why I wanted to have students think about the rhetorical strategies he uses. So this is a mix of, like, I think historians, we also sometimes use rhetorical and literary analysis here. So it's important to point out, like, what kinds of rhetorical strategies he's using. For example, descriptive adverbs and the use of repetition in the first primary source, where he's talking about no other means, no only, this is the only option left. What kind of image do these words create? And what kind of image do they create to about Filipino revolutionaries? Because it's important to contextualize at this time that the US was framing like, you know, manifest destiny. We have to colonize these peoples to bring them out of their inferior political, economic, social situations. We have to educate them. And so what Mbini is doing in his writings is try to say, no, we can educate ourselves. We just need time and true independence, and to be able to really build up our economic, political, and social strength. And so I want students to think in this archival analysis, how does he do this, and how does he make his case? Okay, next slide, please. Finally, I want students here to think about audience. So who do they think are Mabini's audience, and why do you think he wrote these articles? So actually, this I think there's no concrete answer, but most historians think that these letters were written not only for fellow Filipinos, but also to folks like the Anti-Imperialist League and other Americans who were sympathetic of a Filipino revolutionary struggle. And I think it's important to underscore here the role of the written, the role of correspondence, the role of publications in advocating for a broader support of a social movement. Like the Philippine Revolution, and to kind of get buy-in into their cause. And I think at this time, it's also important to say that the Philippines was very fragmented, and the Philippines is actually comprised of many different cultures and different places and the nation itself was created by the U.S. So there was a lot of cultural diversity and arguments at the time of the Philippine Revolution, and I think Daniela is also going to discuss this. So I think what Mabini was doing was trying to unite everybody under this idea of independence and what it means to be a Filipino, which I think Filipinos today are still thinking through, and there's many complexities behind that as well that Daniela is going to discuss, and I think many, indigenous historians, like I think J.A. Ramirez have talked about as well. Next slide, please. And then finally, we have the colonial response to this. I think I'm out of time, so what I'm gonna do is basically say that actually I included this third source as an optional to show optional source, because I think the first were quite a lot already. But if you'd like, if instructors would like to show how the U.S. colonial government responded to people like Mabini, I've included this source to think about for students and instructors to also think about how writings and calls for revolution can be dangerous in multiple ways, and how that led to Mabini's deportation. So this is an optional source only if you have time in your courses. But I love using this to show just how dangerous revolutionary thought could, and just writings, like, it seems so simple, but it's actually quite dangerous for an empire that's trying to rationalize a violent intervention into a different time and place, a different peoples in different place.
We listen to Gabriella. Oh no.
All right, Josephine, that was amazing. Mabini's work is so fascinating, and it's so lovely that you have so many different kinds of examples of his writing and from his life story to draw from to kind of ground an abstract, notion of the Philippine American War in one individual's struggle and with so much wonderful written evidence for what that means. That is tremendous. Thank you so much. Uh, didn't see if you had any additional slides or are there questions that you'd like to
do I
hear?
still have time to go over it?
Oh, sure, yeah.
I think I just checked. I have 3 minutes. Yay.
Yeah.
Um, I thought that I was completely out of time.
No, you're
So
good.
I'm always conscious of time because I tend to be a talker, and if you ever have been in a room filled with a bunch of Filipinos, we talk and laugh and are very expressive people. Okay, so I think like for this primary source, this last primary source, I wanted students to think through General MacArthur, who's actually, I think, the cousin of the president. Describe how does he describe Mabini in the U.S. Senate's 1901 inquiry? So basically, there was like he deported Mabini. The Senate investigated it. Like, why would they deport a disabled revolutionary leader? Like, they fought, and he basically framed it as as like Mabini needing to be deported because he was dangerous and scheming. And in other articles, in other primary sources I have, other U.S. military officials actually said that Mabini needed to that Mabini was using his disability for people to pity him and for Americans to support his cause, which is quite insidious. And my opinion, and I've written about this in my Frontiers article. This is in the Frontiers Journal. It's a gender studies journal, so if you're interested, it's a bit of a long read, so you don't have to assign it, but it does like talk about the role in further detail Mabini's disability and how they were framing it as like dangerous and how like it was a form of monstrosity and they needed to deport him. And then next point. And then I think like I wanted to folks to also analyze like what deportation does, what does physical removal do, and surveillance do, especially in this political moment, to silence a form of protest and revolution. And so I wanted also students to think through how written advocacy and armed resistance can be used in different ways for an anti-colonial struggle, and also how they can be combined and how Mabini is combining it through his writings. Yes, I think that's the end of this lesson plan, but I did like also want to share with folks, like if you want to contact me to learn more, next slide please, you may use my Dartmouth email to contact me if you have further questions. And yeah, thank you for listening. I'm excited to also hear the other panelists' presentations, which I'm sure will also further elaborate on some of the points that I've discussed and introduced in this very brief presentation. Thank you.
Josephine, that was amazing. And I find so many echoes of this past and the struggle for anti-colonial, anti-imperial work in the Philippines and with our present moment, the way that pro-Palestinian speech is being used as a rationale for deportation and for this kind of political silencing. And so we see these struggles, not this wasn't just a singular historical moment, but a particular kind of practice that we see come back again. So so very relevant to our times, very important to kind of think about the historical patterns at work. And this case in the Philippine American War is such an important lesson to return to in these times. So thank you so much. I want to turn now to Daniela. Would you please take the mic?
Okay, so we're gonna do a bit of role playing. we're gonna, I know I'm always nervous about WebEx and audio issues. All right, so we're gonna do a little bit of role playing. We're in Sampaguita Island, right? It's a beautiful island, probably AI generated. And we just happen to be on this island. It was post-apocalyptic, like we're in the island and that's it, right? So as kind of a thought experiment, how do we establish some order to survive? And so I'm gonna give everybody about a minute to just think about it before, don't put it in the chat. Think about it for about a minute and then we'll talk about it or chat about it. Okay, let's pretend that minute passed by. Anybody want to start the conversation in the chat? Please feel free. Okay, thank you, Joss, for being the sacrificial lamb. Okay, ground rules, got it. Yep, food and shelter, right? We're in this island, so we need to establish. Okay, this is a group of very community-oriented people. So they're all cheating. So we're gonna pretend you're not high schoolers, and but you're very educated high schoolers. All right, thank you, everybody. So now we have, okay, so we're gonna delegate tasks. We're gonna organize our, island society, right? How do we establish membership? And what I mean by membership, how do we divide tasks? How do we divide certain privileges? Do other people get more coconuts than other people? What kind of beliefs are we going to have in our little island? Are we going to have a dominant language? So again, I'll give you some time to think about it internally, and then we'll come back. All right. Opinions, comments? That is a great way to divide, Jason. The surfer best surfer gets the most coconuts. We do some kind of voting system. So we're not gonna arm wrestle. Whoever does the best arm wrestling gets the most fish or coconuts. Give more to people who are most in need. So maybe, Sally, who can't quite fish and can't get up the coconut tree, maybe she'll get a little bit more as opposed to all the young people who can break a leg or two. It's fine. All right, so you're gonna find some common thing. Yeah, so we're gonna, because we're in an island, we're gonna establish, doesn't matter who you are, everybody has to swim, right? Let's have a little fun. We'll say, okay, everyone's gonna speak the language of the dolphin. So if you can't speak the language of the dolphin, you can't be a part of the Sampaguita Island. We're bored. There's no internet. There's no Wi-Fi. So we gotta like entertain ourselves somehow. All right. Thank you. So I think we kind of went over this already about how do you pick certain leaders, right? But I kind of want you to think about not just non-physical qualities, but also physical qualities. Like think about the geography, think about, we're in an island, right? So there might be certain physiques that are better suited for certain tasks or leadership roles. Again, I'll give you some time to think about it. Okay. Good listener, that's right. Generous, kind-hearted. Okay. So I don't see the word lazy in there. Got it. Yeah, level-headed is big, right? Because, it's an island, so there might be natural disasters. There might be like a tsunami, and then it's like, what's our plan if that happens? Not power hungry. Maybe coconut hungry, not power hungry. Okay. Resilient, yeah. All right, thank you. So fast forward like 2-3 years, we've done all of the things. So we've established our Sampaguita Island hierarchy, government, voting representative, whatever you want to say, dictatorship, whatever. And then there's a boat, and you're like, what the hell? I thought it was just us. That's weird, So now you have the question of, who are these people? What do we do? How do we assess the boat? Is it a threat? Is it a threat? Or maybe there was no zombie apocalypse. Maybe we just happened to be on this island. I don't know. Right? So what do you think our first course of action is? Yeah, we send a signal. Oh, that's a good one. Send a survey party, strengthen numbers. Should we let them land? Yeah, we don't know their intentions. Oh, all right. Gotta watch out for Josephine. All right. Kali is a Filipino martial arts, if you're wondering what that is. So we sent Josephine out to do a survey party, with her weapons, right? So this exercise seems really silly, right? Like it's like, okay, speaking dolphin. But these are the same questions that the Malolo Congress, which was the first actualization of the Philippine Republic, the first reiteration rather, had, right? How do we ascertain who is going to be a member of our country? Because remember, just as Josephine mentioned earlier, there was no Philippine country. The word Filipino actually referred to Spaniards who are Spanish people who had resettled in the Philippines. It didn't even refer to Filipinos. The Philippines is 7,100 islands and counting, because like every few years they find more islands somehow. There's anywhere from, depending who you speak to, there's anywhere from 120 languages to 170. Again, depends who you talk to, with hundreds of dialects. There are people who are from the north, right? There's the indigenous people, the Igorot. There's the southern indigenous people called the Lumad. There's people who are Muslim. There's the Filipino Chinese traders. There's the mestizos, the people who have interculturally married and have pretty much have place in Philippine society during that time. But there is no Philippine state. It's just, and every island, every city, every town either has its own culture, has its own values. Even if we have similar dishes, people have different ways to cook it, right? So there's no agreement there's no like the recipe, because everyone has their own thing. So these are the same questions that, and Josephine kind of touched on this, of how do you establish that we are a singular country? How do you establish that we are a we? Because these people might not even have spoken the same language. Especially there was a lot of division between the northern part of the Philippines, which was where the Spanish had most control and thus had more influence in terms of the language and culture. For example, they were able to have standardized written Tagalog, for example, right? Like, and the Americans also did that too. But the southern part, like, they don't necessarily, they weren't influenced in that sense, and their language and culture values were, for example, that's where a lot of the Muslim people in the Philippines live. It's in the southern, in the Visayas and Mindanao. In the center is Emilio Aguinaldo, the first Philippine president, and he actually had a lot of I was trying to think of an American eulogy for it, and it's like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. So he's like he's actually he's actually Malcolm X, even though he had Aguinaldo assassinated. So but yeah, so these are the kinds of questions that they had. And at the same time, there's also the perception of the Philippines at the time, at the cusp of its nationhood, the birth of its nation state, right? I'll give you kind of a minute to look at this, because there's a lot going on in this picture. So if anything pops out at you, feel free to put it in the chat, but I'll still give you a minute, because there's a lot of words in this one. Yeah, so it jumps out to you that they're not even being figurative. They literally step on the Philippines. And even at the bottom, the caption says, the Philippines are only the stepping stones to China. And I know the text might be really small, but a lot of the texts say it's referring to trade. So wanted 150,000 bridges, 380,000 engines, 2 million cars, 40,000 railroads. So it's talking about industrialization and needing the resources. So you can see that Uncle Sam is holding the bridges, is holding the seals. So the idea that, oh, we're gonna civilize these people, we're gonna civilize them, and we're gonna bring, he literally has a book that's called Education and Religion, because the Philippines, is a heavily Roman Catholic country because of the 300 years of Spanish occupation. And there's also like a mowing machine, right? So this idea of not only are we going to educate these people, but we're also going to show them technological innovations that they haven't yet had. Here's a similar political cartoon. Again, I'll give you a minute or two. And I'm no art historian, but you can see that the Philippines isn't even centered in this photo, even though it obviously is about the Philippines. It's all the way on the left side, where it's like really tiny. And you see that, because of the 1898 Treaty of Paris, like Cuba is here, Puerto Rico is here. And it's kind of, this political cartoon is showing the beginnings of the US as a global imperial power. I also wanted to, with the rest of my time, I also wanted to talk about, Josephine was talking about Mabini and being deported because of his, calls for revolution. And even though the Philippine Republic was established before the Treaty of Paris was signed, so it was like a few months in between, like they didn't wait, they were like, we gotta go. And so the Philippine Republic viewed itself as being under attack by the American government. But the US viewed it as insurrection, that it's a direct disregard to their governance. And so you see this a lot of, one side sees this perspective and the other side sees the other. And, because Theodore Roosevelt's not for subtlety, he talks about it. This is in not 1992, 1902, sorry, typo. 1902, not 1992, not in the 90s. 1902 address in Arlington Cemetery. And he's literally justifying the war because the Black chaos of savagery and barbarism. So he's not subtle words. Unlike my esteemed colleagues here, I'm not a historian, but I think kind of bringing these perspectives into the classroom and, showing that these people existed, these ideas still prevail, and these are still questions that we're grappling with as a country, particularly, during this current administration. So yeah, that's all I have.
Daniela, thank you. I loved your activity, and to frame the mentality, the perspective of the first Philippine government and the kind of political problems, of cultural problems, economic, and on top of that, then having to think through all of those institution building processes while under occupation. And those are the political contexts that I think make what Mabini's experience so much more rich, to kind of think about that larger political context. And as we progress through these lessons, I really appreciate the way that you framed the context of insurrection and revolution, and that those were parts of the disagreements that led to the kinds of violence that we'll be learning from Kim about. So I really appreciate the way each of you has foregrounded these historical problems, and with such tremendous evidence. So thank you for that. Our third scholar presenter is Dr. Kim Wagner. Will you take the stage?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks to Josephine and Daniela for preparing the ground, as it were. I should start out saying I'm not in America, so you all have my condolences. The rest of the world is watching the US burn. But as you already mentioned, Jason, the things we are discussing right now, they're more relevant than perhaps we would like for them to be. Now, I'm not. I don't teach. I teach in London. I don't teach a module on the Philippines or even U.S. empire. So when I do cover these topics, it's part of histories of Western imperialism, colonial violence, and also more methodological modules on how to read visual sources, for instance. So my primary source is a quite graphic photograph. I included the link to it in the material I sent to Jason. Everybody can Google it themselves. Or I don't know if you want to bring it up on screen, Jason. I should say I start all my classes with a trigger warning, which is certainly necessary in this particular instance. Now, trigger warnings is not. It can be a very perfunctory exercise and something you just like do. You know, you give the students trigger warning and then you traumatize them anyway, and that's not really how it's supposed to work. So what I usually do is I actually have a conversation with the students before we get started, and ask them what trigger warnings mean to them, and actually, you know, go through the process of thinking what it means. And contrary to what right-wingers would like to think, we don't give trigger warnings because we don't like to engage with difficult things. Quite the contrary. We give trigger warnings because there's nothing that we don't, in a sense, look at. But I do think in this day and age, it's absolutely necessary for us to be very clear on what colonial violence is, and in a sense, to not look away, which is also why, and I know this is part of wider discussions and long-standing debates, and I've included Susan Sontag in the readings. There are various views on this, and I'm happy to discuss this further. Some people might also think it's not age appropriate to cover explicit images of racialized violence at particular age groups. The photo is, it shows the aftermath of the Bud Dajo massacre, which took place in March of 1906. It's not part of the Philippine American War, and it's based on the book I published last year. It's called Massacre in the Clouds, and I have to say there's not a single Filipino person or voice in this story. So this is really the aftermath, in a sense, after US rule had been. You can share it now, Jason, if you want. It's when American rule was firmly established in the north, in the Catholic parts of the Philippines. But what I'm talking about is the southern parts, as Daniela already mentioned, the parts where the majority of the population are Muslim. So this is sort of the aftershocks of the Philippine American War, as the Philippines American rule was implemented in the South at the point of the bayonet very much. We see here U.S. soldiers standing literally on top of the dead bodies of the local people known as Moros or Muslims, posing for the cameras. This is not a snapshot. It's not the kind of war photography that we usually used to thinking about today. It's in a genre known as trophy photography. Images, I find students, no matter how lazy they are, no matter how much or how little homework they've done, you can always engage them with visual material. At the same time, however, it's a bit of a tight cliche that an image says more than 1,000 words. You do need more than 1,000 words. In my instance, an entire book to actually make sense, especially of this kind of imagery. But I don't think we should be too squeamish in some ways. Our students, they are bombarded with images, live footage, videos every single day of, in a sense, much worse things that are going on. I do feel in some ways we've failed them in the way that we teach and in a sense prepare them to process the news of things that are happening right now. Jason, you've already sort of hinted at the sort of current relevance and parallels of the things we're talking about. And I think that's, I barely have to point out that you can find very, very similar images from the present. Now, in terms of thinking about this particular image, it's evidence of an atrocity, but in some ways, what's as interesting is not just what the image shows, but the very fact that it was produced in the first place, because it speaks to a racialized worldview in which it's not just justified from an American perspective to kill men, women, and children, but also to treat them as trophies and have a photo like this taken. So the racialized logic that justifies the violence also justifies this kind of photography. And that's why images such as these, which are not, as I said, snapshots, but which are carefully posed. This was mass produced as a postcard. This was a very popular motif. And that again says something of the period, the wider period, where this is the golden age of the postcards, and there are images from the Philippine American War as well. You can go on eBay today and buy them. It was very commonplace for not just US, but also other European imperial powers to photographically document the kind of violence that accompanied the expansion of Western imperialism. There's a number of ways in which we can contextualize this image. The most obvious one is US traditions of trophy photography or atrocity photography, which is of course labels that we apply later on. Something like Wounded Knee, which took place just 16 years before this, was photographically well documented, the aftermath. Lynching photography is another genre which bears more than a passing similarity to this kind of image. And then from the Philippine American War, there are literally hundreds of photographs of US soldiers and what's known as insurrectors. So it's a well-established genre of photography. Now, if we want to sort of read and try and make some kind of sense of what seems to be senseless violence, there's also, of course, an American tradition of settler violence. And indeed, the senior US officers who participated in this particular punitive campaign were themselves veterans of the last stages of the Indian Wars in inverted commas. So there's an American way of war, as it were, that was brought to bear on the Moros in the South. Now, both Josephine and Daniela have hinted at broader non-American imperial traditions, and that's something I think is incredibly important to bring in here. The Americans, this is of course the beginning of the sort of US imperialism beyond the North American continent, Hawaii, we all know the story, Guam, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Cuba, of course. The Americans are very much aware of the fact that they don't have experience in colonial governance. And so there's a concerted effort on the part of US administrators to garner experience from other European imperial powers. And it's quite interesting to see how the commanding officer who leads the troops at Bud Dajo, instead of crossing to the Philippines across the Pacific, he goes the other route and he stops over in Egypt, which is at that point controlled by the British. He stops over in India, also British, and he stops over in Dutch, Indonesia, and Java, quite literally to ask other colonial powers how they govern and how they fight and how they subjugate indigenous people. So we are really talking not just about an American history of an American imperialism, but rather of a trans-imperial project. So this, of course, since I'm sitting in London, it's easy for me, but I know it's at times difficult to pull Americans away from a US-centric perspective. But that's actually what we need to do to really make sense of some of the things that are going on here. And the anti-imperialist movement has already been mentioned, and I'll just sort of briefly bring up the fact that W.E.B. Du Bois, he saw this photograph and he sort of imagined using it as a powerful and effective tool to criticize and protest against continued US occupation in the Philippines, much in the same way that he would later use lynching photography, but also inspired by the Congo movement, of which Mark Twain, for instance, was an important part. So again, we are constantly seeing global parallels. And so throughout the sort of debates that do take place in the US, both the US military, but also anti-imperialists view what is happening in the Philippines within a global comparative framework quite explicitly. It's not just historians today who draw these connections. What is particularly, I'll sort of finish on this. What's interesting about Bud Dajo, the Bud Dajo massacre, during which about 1,000 men, women, and children were killed. It's arguably the biggest massacre of its kind in US history. More people are killed than at Wounded Knee and My Lai combined. I've just spent 10 days at My Lai, so you can see that's where my interests they lie. That massacre is not very well known, and again, that speaks volumes in terms of the kind of American historical awareness. This was not, it didn't take place in secret in 1906. It was widely debated in the Senate and the House as well. It was sort of a national, headline news, but since completely disappeared. And that, much as the American-Philippine Wars, I still encounter Americans who have never really thought much about the Philippines as part of a US history. There are various reasons why this sort of historical amnesia has taken place. Some of it is deliberate, sort of selective ignorance. And that's something I think we should continue to push against. And sort of the kind of histories we've talked about here are incredibly important to challenge the exceptionalist narratives that still in many ways dominate the way Americans, they see the world. I'll finish off just saying students themselves are quite capable and very naturally see the parallels and the contemporary relevance when we discuss colonial violence and when we look at both the sort of the racialized cartoons, the sort of the dismissal of anti-colonial resistance and these kind of images. So I guess it's a bit tragic that in some ways these topics, they more or less teach themselves, but that doesn't mean that we should be complacent. I guess I'll just stop here, but I'm happy, of course, to discuss more.
Yeah, thank you. This is such a powerful way to conclude this portion of the webinar by reminding us that those images of the U.S. stepping on the Philippines in order to as a stepping stone to China, that it involved such tremendous violence and that those were really the same project in one. They didn't happen at different times. The language of sort of civilizing as well as the trade was happening at the same time that they were conducting this anti-insurrectionist kind of mode of occupation. So thank you for really trying to illuminate that, and I think the web of connections you've drawn out for us just on that photo connects not only to a broader U.S. history, but also one that connects the U.S. history in the Philippines to the world in a very powerful way. So I, my job now is to bring Linda and Matt into the conversation. You will have just listened to three scholars talk about how they would teach this subject, and so would really love to hear. You know, we know you didn't come to this webinar having read Kim's book or Josephine's article, and just hearing the richness of these lessons and this approach to teaching this subject of U.S. history and Asian American history. What are some of your responses?
Yeah, so I can answer that question. So overall, I just want to thank all the panelists. And I definitely I really loved how we started talking about with an emphasis on the different point of views of different people throughout history. Because what Kim was saying, a lot of times as a student, high school student in Connecticut, a lot of times I'm only surrounded by one point of view, the United States. And when I was younger, someone told me oh, a lot of textbooks are Eurocentricized, and I was so blown away because that never appeared in my brain. And I think what Daniela was having with her presentation by having the students firsthand having to experience what's happening, they're able to emphasize a lot more with what's happening. They're able to comprehend a lot more with the difficulties, the challenges that a lot of people had, and just understand these point of views a lot more clear. And so I think that's an amazing way to teach history, is through these point of views and having students themselves be involved and almost be a part of this history in a sense. And I also I had a question for any of the panelists can really answer this, but as a high school student who living in the United States and with having textbooks, and a lot of them are Eurocentricized, how can I navigate through breaking this, breaking what my mind has, and extending out to different sources, and making sure that what I'm reading is the correct part of history.
I love that question, Linda.
Yeah, that's a great one. So thank you, Linda. Thanks to the panelists. You were all wonderful, and your expertise is just on show for everybody. I really enjoyed the different materials and resources you each brought to your lessons. The primary source of reading someone's voice is so powerful, and I think it really gives a human aspect to the voices and the topics that we're dealing with. So I think Dr. Ong, your text and the variations of having more than one to show these humans, and allow the readers to sort of challenge and dive into the words, which we don't write like that anymore, right? We've lost that sort of romantic language, but almost out of necessity, right? They needed to be visual. They needed to be heartfelt. They needed to be very clear in their writing. So great way for students to experience that. I love political cartoons. Students jump in on them. You think as a teacher, right? You think that you have the cartoon mastered and memorized, and then there's always a student that picks up one other little aspect, one detail, or makes a connection you weren't ready for. So it was always a great one that I thought I had down pat, as a lesson, and it's something I could memorize. And then students always come in and bring in their own perspective, which is great. And I think Professor Wagner, the photography is big, going along with the other types of visuals. But I think the way that you build your relationships with your students to get them prepared, not just emotionally prepared for the rawness of them, but at least to get their thoughts out there, their reactions to what is going on. I thought each one of these is a great job of really enabling the different classrooms to look at the event from such a wide variety of perspectives, and I think that's crucial for young people. And Linda, I think that's how you figure it out, right? You're always asking who's not being talked about, or whose experience wasn't there, or what's their side of the story, and you start thinking out on your own by first questioning, how did others feel about this event? Thank you.
I wonder if it might also be, helpful to talk about this, to talk about the Philippine American War in a kind of broader, more general context of, say, like what you were explaining, Kim, about the sort of succession of the cycles of conquest between the American West and then being practiced again in the Philippines. And so I'd like to hear from folks, what are some of the sort of frames of reference, those sort of big categories that you think are useful to frame these questions, to build relationships with students around the topic? What are some of the things that you think are useful for you in your teaching?
I can start quickly. Cartoons have been brought up. I always, of course, I teach Kipling when I teach the British Empire, but the fact that The White Man's Burden was written about the US, and it was actually published in the US, I think in February 1899. But Kipling, he sent the poem to Theodore Roosevelt personally months before. Really sort of ties in and sort of brings different, what students perceive to be different histories together in quite concrete ways. I mean, I guess you basically expressed it yourself, Jason, but it even, clicked for me when I read the work of Ollie Charbonneau on US rule in the Southern Philippines. But his point is basically that in the Southern Philippines, it's a settler project. They talk about Mindanao as a white man's world. So if we think of the U.S. conquest of the Philippines as simply being a continuation of westwards expansion of its manifest destiny, you move west and then you get to the Pacific, and then it's a skip and a hop across to the Philippines, and it simply continues. The language being used, Indian country, comparisons to the Apaches, same use of violence. When you take what the students know and sort of take them by the hand and show how it applies in different contexts, you can actually push them much, much further and introduce them to completely new worlds, quite literally, when you show them that this is, it looks like something you've never heard of, but actually it's a very familiar situation we find in completely new places.
That's wonderfully put. Thank you. Yeah, Josephine.
Building off of what Kim has said, I think it's important. I think in like history courses, right? Even if it's like I'm thinking back because high school for me wasn't that far ago. Like it's like done chronologically, right? And I think like the frames of like reference we can talk about is the historical origins of manifest destiny in the colonization of what we now know as the Northeast. And I think like for I'm also trained in Indigenous studies, so I can like say like a couple of sources, Indigenous historians like Ojibwe historian Gene O'Brien to look into about like the Indigenous namings of place and how that connects like in the frontier violence that I think Phil Deloria talks about, and Vinny Deloria, and then to like contextualize that to westward expansion. And part of the reason why the Philippines was annexed was because like they hit the end of like the West Coast and they wanted more. And I think like having that framework shows that empire evolves and adapts, and that it constantly also needs more to continue running. And I think it has both an implication in US history, but also world history, especially because in looking through the Spanish and the US empire's competitions for power, it's like showing an empire in decline, but also an empire that's trying to start up. And the Philippine American War actually reveals a lot of those tensions. I like that's why in my own work I like actually focus a lot on that 1890s period to show like how a community of people can get like forcibly caught up in these like different imperial struggles, and how that actually impacts the community. What does it actually do to community? And I think that has a lot of contemporary resonances today that students can relate to. And I think reading the works of organizers can also lead students to think about how do we actually apply this to the present? What are the different strategies that young folks especially can do to to resist against like colonial strategies that are happening today. Yeah, I think and I also really appreciate like how our works actually speak towards one another and the different strategies we use. I really also like Daniela's visuals, and I appreciated Kim's like your framing of the top of the violence, especially for Filipino folks in the audience. I think it helps prepare us, because sometimes like we have to kind of like be like, okay, unbiased observer, but that's impossible considering a racialized position. So I think the way that you do that is really great, especially for young students who, and students of color in general, who are sometimes being forced to be desensitized to their own oppression and subjugation.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'm a sociologist, so I'm always thinking about social constructions of realities, right? So for me, particularly with this conversation, I'm kind of interested in the development of the Philippine identity, but also how ideas of racial construct impacted Filipino ideas of race. Because before then, there was no, so I'm thinking specifically about like the case where Black veterans who were fighting on behalf of the US Army, they came to the Philippines, and they're kind of being confronted with this idea of like, oh, it's not just Black and white, there's also Filipino. And like, where do you fall in this spectrum of, you're not white, you're not Black, but you're being oppressed, and yet we're fighting for freedom, and but then we're oppressing you guys. And so this idea of kind of evolving ideas of racial superiority and also stratification within societies, like a lot of the sources I'm not a historian, so I had to do a lot of research, unlike Josephine and Kim. I had to be like, what am I doing? I'm more on contemporary migration. But I think there's so many of not, depressingly, I guess, not much has changed, right? Like these ideas of who deserves citizenship, who deserves legal status, who deserves membership, inclusion into our society. These questions haven't really changed all that much. So, you would hope they change. But so I think it is interesting. For me, it was really easy to connect it to contemporary times, because I just thought, even more ideas of what is race, right? Like it wasn't until the 2010 census that we allowed people to pick two racial categories, which is wild because multiracial people have existed forever. And so, thinking about it in that context. So.
Yeah, such amazing insights. I'm so grateful for the conversation. I want to turn to the sort of second half of the webinar now. And what I think it might be interesting for us to for me to briefly kind of share some of the ways that Connecticut is actually connected to the Philippines through the Philippine American War, through the Spanish American War. That this project of territorial occupation and conquest in the Philippines was very much tied to Connecticut. And as we're trying to develop an API, an Asian American Pacific Islander curriculum for Connecticut, I think bringing out those kinds of contexts is super important. And so, when we look at the contemporary Asian American communities in Connecticut, like Daniela, you're talking about contemporary migration. Filipinos are a part of Connecticut's communities, and but they also are here because of this long legacy of U.S. colonialism. So one of those legacies is the connection with the training of nurses, as well as the enlistment of men into U.S. Navy. And so when we look at Connecticut's Filipino American community, there are many nurses as well as Navy vets, and we see them. They're here as a part of our the rich tapestry of Asian American communities, and so that shows that even though this like I can't remember who said it, but it feels very distant, feels very far away. There is a deep, intimate connection to Connecticut, and so one of the things that one of the political cartoons I draw from is one that shows the trade negotiations that the U.S. was engaged in. The designing of new tariffs, something that we're very familiar with nowadays, designing of new tariffs around which goods the United States would impose on its new possessions, like Puerto Rico and the Philippines. And some of the loudest advocates for these tariffs were from Connecticut. And they advocated for tariffs on tobacco. And those tobacco tariffs against Philippine tobacco allowed for the tobacco industry in Connecticut to thrive, right? So these kinds of connections are so rich and so deep. And if you're talking about imperial trade, you have to also talk about the imperial violence. And Connecticut is also home to Colt manufacturing, which created a weapon called the Colt 45, which was designed specifically to participate in the kind of mass violence that Kim was describing, and particularly for establishing a new kind of weapon that would be able to take down moral warriors in that environment, in that humid environment. And so the development of the Colt 45 happened here in Connecticut and was built in Hartford for that war. So these kinds of connections and learning about this rich history helps to ground students' understanding of these events, as well as the world around them, that it has these deep connections. And so this is just like kind of a brief introduction to the amazing ways that the Philippine American War, seemingly, as Kim said, it might be something that you're not familiar with, but then once you start peeling back the pieces of the puzzle, that see that it is a really intimate connection to our world right here in Connecticut. So I offer that as a kind of as an introduction for Linda and Matt to guide us now into thinking about what would you like to see as a part of this this effort to build an Asian American and Pacific Islander curriculum, and specifically around this lesson. What are some of the what questions would you have about how it's implemented, or what would you hope that that students get out of learning about these lessons?
Yeah, so I think we kind of like briefly like touched about this like throughout like every single person who has spoken today. But I think like a really big question that a lot of like high school students that like are learning history is like, how is this relevant to me today? Because like we're obviously like learning about things that are in the past. And so I really enjoyed how like everyone kind of touched on like this topic, but then also like how like students like me can like actually like take this knowledge away and implement it in my daily life. And I also thought it was really interesting how like Jason talked about like local history, especially with like tobacco. I thought it was a really cool fact. But I think just like any way to like kind of connect with like students in their daily lives and like how like we can like use this knowledge. Um, because I think that'll definitely make things like a lot more engaging for a lot of different students.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think students are always wanting to know exactly, the purpose behind their topics in there. And I think this is a great one in terms of being able to, I mean, listen to us, right? We have drawn these connections across time and space and theme and groups to really stretch into the role of the globe, right? The different countries in the world. Looking at this specific event, right, we start to see not just some, and from American perspective, a small part of the Spanish American War, right? That just was a different battlefield in a different continent. Um, but rather, we start to see uh, these great impacts, right? Like you think about, well, I'm just a tobacco farmer. What are these tariffs going to do for me? Right? Or you think these are far away, right? Or you think I'm not that ethnicity, but any dark skin, right, gets grouped together in some of the racist responses within our country's history. Um, all the way down to things like new technology, right? And new infrastructure pieces. Um, I think a little bit about this time period because of all of the new industrial era. Um, I used to tell students that it's like imagine if you wrote that one code that deletes your messages from Snapchat, right? You invented that one code. That's like, getting the timing right of a cotton gin, right? Like getting it right on this one little moment. You're able to create this one little piece that has rippling effects throughout those elements. And I think the development from, at least from the United States, with the race for infrastructure and industry, um, of course, continuing on with Manifest Destiny, the original sort of white privilege of the time. And I think um, you're almost able to customize it for your classroom space. Um, if you have art students, the images and the cartoons in that space. If you're doing cross curriculum work with English departments, or at one point I worked at a technology and design school, and we looked a little bit at some of the inventions and the actual machinery that was working, and what they needed, and how that differed from something that looked in the past. And so I think all of these elements can boil down into the Philippine American War, which people is sort of the best part of history. It's the surprise at the end, like, you thought you were learning about Philippine American War. Well, let me show you about the entire globe, right? And these are the struggles of not just of imperialism, but of a growing people who are now, because of early colonialism changing, they're looking for their own independence and their own identity. Like I thought Daniela's activity was fantastic with the it at first I was wondering where we were going with the survivor piece of it, and then to quickly pinpoint it, I was like, okay, I see this. Okay. And it worked. I was hooked. I was ready for the next part of the lesson. Um, so I think there's a lot of little pieces that we can take away from the topic overall. Um, you never underestimate Connecticut. I mean, we have our hands in just about anything that's being made, that's being experienced, um, and I think there are always these opportunities for Connecticut educators, whether it's the tobacco fields, whether it is the art museums, the cold manufacturing, simple spaces you could do a tour. Um, to the history of being involved in all of the major themes of history. I'm thinking back to some of the enslavement pieces that happened in early Connecticut history. I think the classes, right? Educators should grab a piece from all of these wonderful professors and educators here. Thinking about your students, preparing them for the material, looking at it from a way for them to utilize those skills. I counted all my historical thinking skills with Professor Ong's lessons, right? Viewpoints, collaboration, intent, time period in which these primary sources came into play. So there are so many elements of the academic involved in each one of these. I think grabbing one piece of these all help a classroom pedagogy to, if not directly learn about Philippine experience, certainly understanding the role that historical events play in our world.
I want to invite our scholars to respond. If you would, do you have any questions for Linda and Matt?
I think I have a general thought that building off of what Linda and Matt said, that maybe like before our curriculum goes out, there could be an added question in between, like to kind of like integrate some of what we discussed here. Like a guiding question of how does this relate to contemporary situations, and how does this relate to um, students' own, like what they see around them in their own communities in Connecticut, because I know Connecticut is also quite diverse. Although honestly, I've only really experienced Connecticut through buses in between New York and Boston, where I went to college. My family lives in Jersey, so I'm often like crossing through Connecticut, but I haven't really been in Connecticut. But I think that asking students to think about like how does this relate to me, and I think like how does this like how do my individual experiences connect to a broader system, and that like the reason why there's so many contemporary resonances is because empire grows and it also adapts, and these are like similar strategies that maybe adapted for a different period. And I think that um, having that be woven into our lesson plans would be, I think, a more concrete way of kind of solidifying what we've discussed here, because I think it's really important and something I was unsure of whether or not to incorporate that, but I think like hearing from Matt and Linda made me think that it is important to do that and to like then directly word it out. And I think in a way that's engaging, like students could do a free write, they could like do, I think, like all sorts of like different interactive activities with this too.
Yeah, so I was thinking about the question, and without the Philippine American War, so the Philippine American War basically created US nationals. That's a category that Filipino immigrants or Philippine citizens in the United States had, so they could work and live freely in and out of the United States. So when the Asiatic barred zone happened and China was excluded, Japan had the gentleman's agreement, and like to understand Indians too, like in India, not indigenous to the US. So that kind of established the kind of the starting of the migration, like because before then it was only like Filipino international students, essentially pensionados, that were coming in. There was like 100 of them, like it wasn't that big of a migration flow. And then so without the Philippine American War, the US and Philippine relations would look completely different, right? And it wasn't until the 1940s, Philippine independence, that they actually started being like, hey, you can't enter and work in the United States however you want because you're not an American territory anymore, which really contrasts like, Puerto Ricans who have US citizenships, and Guam and the territories in the Pacific. So like for me, like it's you can't really talk about migration and contemporary, like why we're here, without talking about what happened in Philippine American War.
Already touched upon many of these issues, but I think the contemporary parallels in terms of construction of race and in terms of nationhood, delegitimizing resistance, I think one of the strongest sort of links is in terms of the Muslim identity of the Moros in the South, particularly during the period of US intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan. is quite shocking to see how little, if anything, has changed over the course of the century. American occupation of the southern Philippines is the first time that U.S. soldiers, they fight Muslims, but we see the development of Islamophobia and the same kind of tropes exactly as we see them today. In many ways, Muslims constructed as sort of a race apart, who exist beyond the law, who are not protected by conventional legal structures. And just thinking again about the photography, when Abu Ghraib happened, one of Susan Sontag's last pieces was she mentioned lynching photography as kind of a way that helped her to make sense of Abu Ghraib, and I think that is we need to learn about the past to understand the present. It's a tired trope, but sometimes it's actually spot on. And I think in many ways it's easier to address and try and process the sort of the chaos through which we are living by looking at past events that are so very, very similar, and in many instances directly connected, causally or otherwise.
So well put. Thank you all. Linda, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I would love to hear more. How does this conversation feel in terms, and when you're listening to these scholars talk about how they feel it's relevant, do you feel like they've addressed your question about how this would, how this is connected, and how students could use this learning beyond the awareness of new facts?
Yeah, of course. I think like definitely it's like really refreshing to hear like a lot of like the different opinions from you guys and like how we can implement it into our daily lives. Um I think like another thing that like I think like stuck particularly with me is like this is like in the chat, but Josephine said like especially like how we need to learn beyond like AP exams and like AP curriculum because like as an AP like student I feel like a lot of the times when we like learn like history and things like that, a lot of times it feels rushed and a lot of times it feels like I'm studying like this information just to memorize it and just to like do well on the test. But then that also means that I'm trading off like the experience of like actually being able to engage with what I'm learning and truly understand like the significance of what I'm learning. Um, and this actually leads to like a question that I was kind of like thinking about. But like I know that like in like for like in like a lot of different times in history, like the actual end of like some sort of war doesn't actually mean like the end of like the tensions that it has left upon like the people. So I was wondering if like there were any like lasting impacts or tensions that have not been resolved since the war.
That's another awesome question,
I know we're
Linda.
all jumping, but anybody who wants to start?
I very quickly, there are still certain views of the presence of American troops in the South. It's I don't know if any of you remember that Duterte in 2016, he actually held up the photo from Bud Dajo when Obama, he was criticizing the human rights record or lack thereof. So there are, I mean, as much as Jason mentioned the education of nurses, and there's a long history of Philippine American diaspora and other things, but there's a lot of local tension and maybe bitterness is too harsh of a word, but there's definitely a legacy in that respect.
I think like what history can do a lot is contextualize what is happening in the more recent past, but also the present and what can happen in the future. And I think like understanding the impacts that like the colonization of the Philippines had, and multiple layers and multiple colonizers had in the Philippines, shows why there are so many Filipinos all across the world, not just in the United States, but also in, I think recently it's been in the Middle East. Has often been like the where Filipino migrants are, and what is this racialization of Filipinos as being a constant exportable source of labor, and how does it actually impact Filipinos today? And I think it also relates like to it shows that like like an instance of war has like lasting impacts on a whole country's economic situation. Like the Philippines, for instance, is like the elites like Aguinaldo, who had like economic and political power because they had land, are still the people that have a lot of money in the Philippines today. Like Chinese Filipinos like me, like still control a lot of the um, merchant like industrialization, like kind of sort resources in the Philippines. And there's actually that huge income gap between the rich and the poor are also what lead Filipinos to come to places like Connecticut and to be nurses. And I think like that's important to contextualize that. I think, Linda, as you're pointing out, that war is just the act of warfare is not just like one instance, it's like the lasting impacts of it. And like what happened to Filipinos, like and also impacts our identity. And I think, as maybe Danielle can speak more to, there was often like I think the racialization of Filipinos not deserving self-rule led to a lot of like I think of what is often called like inferiority complex, like white is better, and like going to the US makes you better. I believed in that. That's partially why I ended up like I grew up partially in the Philippines when I was a kid, and like our parents thought, oh, the US and Guam is still an American territory or colony, basically. So like going to the US for many Filipinos is like a narrative of a better life, and that still continues today because of these earlier narratives. Yeah, and it's like something that I grew up with as well. And like when I was a kid, this was like built into it's supposedly independent countries curriculum. It's still there, so it's like interesting. Both in like the formal school and in the informal school, like at the everyday streets, like Americano is better, but we also still shade on them. So like in Tagalog, so they don't understand, and I speak Tagalog, so I can understand it. Yeah, yeah. I think Daniela, I think maybe we have some resonances here. You can pick up
Yeah,
on
no,
later.
that's funny you mentioned being, I'm often racialized as Filipino Chinese. I'm not. Like my great grandfather was Chinese, but like ethnically, I'm not a Filipino Chinese person. And it took me moving to the US to realize I had Filipino Chinese privilege, because I realized that's why everyone's nice to me, because they thought I was rich. Like I didn't know. And and it took me kind of moving out of the Philippines and moving to a country. And like I often talk to my students like, oh, hey, I learned I was Asian. And they're like, what? I'm like, the Asian wasn't a racial category where I grew up in the Philippines. Like we're just Filipino. Like, I mean, there's differences in class. And a lot of these ideas of hierarchy, right? Like class-based, especially colorism, like it still kind of relates to people living in the United States, because like especially if you're East Asian, right? There's like colorism within like it's not like whiteness in terms of like white understanding whiteness, but whiteness as a concept in Asia. So it's yeah, I think it's kind of hard for me not to think about how it still impacts me today, because it still impacts me, whenever I go back home, right? People are like, "Hey, you're Chinese." I'm like, "I am so not Chinese." Yeah, like, or a Chinese tourist, and and that's because our ideas of race was impacted through this war. Because prior to that, it was pretty much a melting pot. Not that people, things were like kumbaya, we all got along, but like understanding, like I would, pay for a time machine, like what was people's understanding of race during that time before American colonization? Because in Spanish colonization, it's pretty easy. Like, do you have Spanish blood or do you not? Like, like that's pretty much it. But after American colonization, these ideas, which still permeate today, right? Like, Filipinos are still like whitening themselves with papaya soap, and they'll bleach themselves, glutathione. And it's like and even if they don't know the health impacts of whitening their skin, it has so much. Like in my own research, like I had interviewees who were like, hey, like they said that, you know, I needed to be lighter skinned because I'm selling makeup in the mall. And I was like, what? You know, so it's crazy that they were like, if I'm not light skinned enough, I can't make a living selling makeup in the mall, which is like, you know, it's mostly service industry jobs there, right? So yeah, I don't.
I mean, that's such an important kind of lesson, I think, about the legacies of war that are internalized, and um, in that we're talking about evidence, the different kinds of primary sources, and when we look at speeches, we look at text that's written from a historical actor. We're looking at institution building and different patterns of violence. Um, you know, it when we're looking for the kinds of uh, e- evidence of internalization, right? I think that is a really interesting question for students, because it might be something that they haven't practiced themselves, and so a lesson which you know which brings these external kinds of sources to bear on an interrogation or a kind of investigation of the self, and it is really fascinating, and I think a really important and a way for students to connect with the material. Because I think, well, we're talking about the Philippines, I think this is something that everyone experiences, some form of internalization. And so, I think turning to the arts and culture as forms of evidence, and particularly stories like Daniela, the story you just told about the mall was so powerful and it was so simple. But I think having those, being able to thread together these different contexts and lived experience, I think is just such a powerful way to demonstrate, this question, Linda, that you've led with, like, how is this relevant, right? How does the world impact how we think of ourselves, right? How we relate to one another, shape the economy that we live in, and the goals. Like Josephine was saying, one of the legacies of the war was shaped our family's migration choices, and so I think these are really amazing kinds of learning experiences that I'm really excited for Asian American Studies to be in the classroom to help to build these kinds of connections to both new knowledge, but also new practices too of investigating the world and investigating ourselves. So I wondered if Matt, if you could talk a little bit about maybe questions you have or concerns you have about how we could incorporate this work in the classroom. Maybe take from your years of teaching. What maybe if you could share maybe a challenge or a strategy that you found to be really useful and constructive. Maybe it's around connecting with students to prepare them for these kinds of lessons, or that threading together of the different kinds of evidence.
Well, from my perspective, in my experience teaching this point, I felt like there was no end to the dots that were getting connected. And I think that gives a lot of freedom and flexibility to educators, because, and depending on your school's sort of your social studies approach to the curriculum, if you're doing it chronologically, if you're doing it thematically, right, there are moments in there in which you can really access this pivotal event. I often used it as one example of American imperialism at the time. There was so much going on in those sort of 25, 30 years after the Civil War. With American imperialism, we started to expand on this to really look at how each different experience might be similar, linked. What themes do we see? Is there one sort of even chronologically, but directly related? And I think as an educator, when you have identified not your theme, but your approach to the curriculum, you're able to use the Philippine American War in a lot of really unique ways. You can use it as this example of a native people dealing with an aggressive outsider. You can use it for economic development and growth at a period that we haven't seen that level of invention coming forward. I sometimes used it as sort of this growth of the industrial era of now that we're making more of these items, we need to sell more of these items, find these other pieces. But even then, I caught myself being a little Eurocentric, right? That this is why we're doing this because we've got steel rails now being produced more than we can use and only so many skyscrapers. So it was almost used as an excuse for going off into colonizing these places, which students, like I said, even with the cartoons, students are going to come up with things that you're not prepared for in your classes. They're going to make those unique conclusions. Maybe if you teach long enough, you might hear them repeated, but at the same time, they're going to come in with some of it might be their own examples, right? Oh, that's what it's like for being this skin tone, or I know what it's like being identifying as two groups, right? As you were saying, as Chinese and Filipino. I had this great opportunity for a neighbor to come in. She is African Indian, and I apologize if I sort of brutalize it all, but the same slave trade that British was using anywhere else, right, within India, was to use Indian immigrants to do labor in Africa. And we see the same sort of breakup and division within society, whether it's colorism, whether it's ethnicity within certain communities. But she came into my African American Studies class and was sort of like, whoa, I didn't even realize this level of immigration and slave labor and the differences between your hometown, right? When it's in your hometown or home village or home nation, what those things look like and how that has lasting impact on people from all sorts of backgrounds when you get into migrant stories. So for educators who are watching this, I would say, utilize what you do in your classroom, utilize your personal approach to teaching. Find some aspect, and we do this often as educators. Each year we find something new to teach that we might have missed. It might have been curious. We might not have gotten time to, but we often try to make that intentionally part of our curriculum. And I think next time you're looking at, who blew up the Maine off the shores of Cuba, why don't you turn it over and say, okay, let's look at this unique conundrum of turning from one enemy to a new enemy, and how that growth of experience for the people in the nation of the Philippines, versus just an extension of the American military complex or industrial complex with the industries. I thought this was a great topic because it brings forward it. To me, it had a little bit of Vietnam themes going on, with a lot of that. So I think if a teacher were to look at the people's perspective, the indigenous perspective in those areas, you could dive into a lot of it there. I think I'm talking myself into circles, so I'll stop there.
No, I mean that was such a great way to end that point because one of the things I wanted to remind viewers is that we have other episodes of How to Teach, and one of them is the Vietnam War. Last year we did How to Teach the Korean War, and these are all, as you said, as many of us have said today, that they're interconnected, and to find those overlapping, ways of integrating the curriculum. Um, so, so we've really had an amazing conversation, and I still feel like we're just scratching the surface of where this inquiry could go. And I just want to thank, Linda and Matt for being up for this conversation, and for just having, helping us build out what's really important about this work. So thank you very much. Kim, Josephine, Daniela, this has been just tremendous to have your expertise in-house, and I've collected your lessons and your preambles for for a teaching guide. We'll have that linked to the recording, and the teachers will be able to listen to your presentations. They'll be able to read the lessons, and glean some experience from the conversation, to bring it into their classroom, and to explore maybe new dimensions that we haven't even talked about yet. So so this has been I've been wanting to do this webinar for a really long time, and I'm so glad that all of you are part of making it such a great experience. So thank you again, and open the floor for anyone who would like to make any last comments.
Jason, I was wondering if the other attendees have any final questions for us. Yeah. And I also like for my final comment, I really appreciate both Linda and Matt's perspectives, and I think like as scholars, we're also like teachers, and it's making me think about like improving my how to engage, continue to improve like my pedagogy in the college classroom. Yes, I think we do have a little bit of a different context, but yeah, it's making me think about my own classrooms as well.
I'm not seeing any questions, but thank you for asking that, Danielle. I forgot to come back to that point I got so excited about the conversation. So you all are too good at this.
I'll end on a fun fact. I found out from my research that boondocks is from the word bundok in Tagalog, which means mountain. So the US soldiers would use it because they were like, oh, the maps that we have are outdated. They're not working. We don't know where we're going. And then they brought it back to the US. So now I'll never stop thinking about boondocks in the Philippine American War, because I thought that was like so interesting, right? Like in terms of how do you connect it to contemporary times? I was like, whoa, mind blown. And maybe like only scholars will nerd out about that. But I thought that was really cool.
Oh, Joss is saying that they can't unmute, but just wanted to say the presentation was amazing. Thank you all for being here and sharing with us. Thank you, Joss. And yeah, Boondock, when I learned about that too, I was like, oh my gosh, this is, it feels so, like one of those things that you don't know the origins, but you see it everywhere, right? And so being able to trace back those lineages is another example of Linda's question about the afterlives of war.
Manila paper too. I looked that up too. Manila paper, same thing. Like, oh, like where'd that come from?
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Okay, well, we're gonna have to continue this. Maybe there's certainly enough here to do a 2.0 on this webinar. So so maybe if we have the time and resources, we'll invite you back to continue the conversation, and maybe hear from some teachers who've implemented this work in their classroom, and to see what else we can learn. Thank you again, everyone. Have a great evening.
Same to you all. Good to see you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.